Well, thinking about this panel, I had this idea that it would be interesting to go back and read the first poem of each of the 3 books that I've written together. And then when I did that, which I've never done myself, it sort of revealed something to me. So I'll tell you about that afterwards. So this first poem is the first poem from my first book of poem, The Next Country. The poem's called East of Here. In the next country over, the lotus is chocolate brown and grows tall as maize. The sole religion seems to be bread, any kind, including one similar to rye, but made of lotus. And if someone you've doted on dies there defending the nation, 7 emissaries for the president come by, all wearing stethoscopes, and listen to your heart. Afterward, they offer artichoke sandwiches and official blue saran wrap, and hand you either a list of answers or questions, but never both. There's a road if you want to go. And this is the first poem from my second book of poems, Exit Civilian. It's a long series, but I'll just read the first one. It's called The Little Prison. Enter the little prison a comma, and you come out a question mark. Enter a scallop, and you come out the shell. Enter in English, and you come out murmuring what your great-grandmother murmured to other shells on another shore. Enter an apple, and come out the teeth marks and its yellowed core. And then this is the first poem in my most recent book, was this collaboration with the artist Erica Baum. And it's a series of epistolary poems that are addressed to Clarice Lispector, whose novel I had translated in less than a year, and it was a rather intense year, and it was a rather intense deadline to do it all. So I ended up writing a series of poems to her about thinking about the act of being a translator. And they're all addressed to her. Dear C, I'm turning from, have been syntaxed and stirred into a purple, blurred to blind. I made a mess of page 22, couldn't resurrect what you left unsaid into words that wouldn't. Do you believe in grieving? I mean for language, the endangered animal of, fleeing into caves. I can only keep after it in fits, or I get trapped in the keeping after. That and bliss, you're spinning but devoted, I-N. And so they're very different books and very different poems, but when I was reading them all, I kind of realized that what they had in common is they're all poems of annihilation, of feeling annihilated in some way. And I was like, oh, I guess I'm just really interested, or right out of, there are a lot of poems for me begin in the sense of feeling annihilated in some way or another. And while I was thinking about this, I came across a great quote from Sarah Ruhl, the playwright Sarah Ruhl, and she said that she occasionally felt annihilated by her 3 children, and then at some point she just said, you know what, go ahead, annihilate me. That earlier self was a fiction anyway. And I love that quote. And I was like, yeah, I feel that way about my children sometimes too, and apparently about everything, since that seems to be my motivation as a poet, is to seek opportunities for annihilation in some way. So that first poem I wrote while I was living in Chile and was speaking basically only in Spanish and living in Spanish and teaching at a domestic violence shelter in Spanish and teaching creative writing in Spanish. I never really spoke English to anyone. I read in English and I wrote in English and felt very nervous that this self I had constructed in college that had lots of things to say about June Jordan and Jean Reese was going to disappear because I never talked about them. And then at some point I was like, oh well, go ahead, Chile, annihilate me. That self was too fragile anyway. You know, I just kind of went with it. And then I wrote a lot of the poems for my first book once I sort of stopped being fearful that I had this earlier self I had to protect, and that was fragile and that would only survive if she stayed isolated. And I don't really think that we think maybe poems come from that, and like the culture of residencies may in fact encourage that concept, but I do think that you have to be willing to be annihilated in some way in order to create poems in a way that don't repeat what you've written before. And then for the poems in The Little Prison, which I think also sort of feeling annihilated from the language, the way I talked about poetry or even about the United States before working in the American prison system, was also happened where I would go and teach in the prison system. I would go through all these beeping doors to go and teach and then come back out. And I was worried about, I think, everything. And then finally I was like, well, there's only so much I can do about this giant American problem. And then I just wrote the poems. It was also another thing where I kind of got stuck on something, and until I let it go, I couldn't quite get to the poems that I needed to write. And I think with the third book of poems, I knew I was writing about how being a translator was sort of inviting annihilation in a way. I think, like Sarah Rule, you get to be a little older, you know yourself better. And I realized not only that, some kind of annihilation is necessary to write, that I actually look for it, I seek it. And so otherwise, I think you can't really translate without being willing to erase yourself and let someone else's voice come through you. But I hadn't read any poems like that, and I wanted to see if I could write them. So in some ways, I think that the act of annihilation can then become an act of resurrection. And so that to find my voice as a poet, I kind of needed to destroy it to then recreate it again. So anyway, I was so glad to have this reason for the panel to go back and look at these poems, because I don't think I would have known that about myself, that I'm sort of a seeker of annihilation in some way. But the one last thought I had about this was that I recently sold a novel and have to do the edits, and I had picked an epigraph to put at the beginning, and I love George Oppen, and so the epigraph I chose for the book was a line of his, which is the act of being more than oneself. And I was like, yes, that's true. It's apparently the quote I seek out all the time. It's that act of being more than oneself. I think that, I'll just switch countries or jobs or languages or something. But I guess for me, that's where poems begin. So, well, I think that's the hope. I think that, there's in order to create something new, there has to be a surrender of something old, otherwise you can't reinvent. You can't do something new that you haven't done before. You have to let go of something, which is a part of yourself. So I think it's easier, as I found, and I think that Sarah Rule quote gets at that, which is that you have to be willing to annihilate something in order to create something new, and that without letting go of some earlier poetic self, you can't innovate. I did an event with a great website called Words Without Borders. If you don't know this website, it's a great place to find a lot of poetry from around the world. And there was an event a couple nights ago, for a Words Without Borders event on Guatemalan literature. But it wasn't really Guatemalan literature, it was Guatemalan prose. So we were talking about new writing from Guatemala, and I asked why there wasn't any poetry in the issue, and it was because all the writers who were involved actually live outside of Guatemala. None of them are there. So they sort of have this expat community, and the Guatemalan poets are still there, and they have their own thing going on, but it's very much underground. And the editor, Eduardo Halfon, who was in charge of the issue, had no contact with them. And a lot of people in Guatemala don't know what they're doing either, because they're publishing their poems in stapled versions and sharing them with each other. But that's very much, I think, a record and a testament to what's happening in Guatemala, and probably has much more to do than people who, or in a different way, with what's being written by Guatemalans who are living in exile or as expats. And I think similar things happen in lots of countries, and even here, that there's a lot of poetry happening. And even if we don't know about it, I do think it's not art for art's sake so much as art for humanity's sake, and that the fact that the poetry happens is part of our humanity, regardless of how many people are reading it or involved with it. That I think we wouldn't want to live in a country where there was no poetry. It's just part of our ongoing humanity. In some way. Yeah. I also grew up in a family where there were no other writers. I grew up in a small town on the Pennsylvania border with West Virginia, so it was deep, deep Pennsyltucky, Appalachia. I don't know what else to call it. It was sort of completely off the map of anything happening anywhere else, or that's what it felt like. And there wasn't a lot of poetry that happened in the little school I went to, or even in my family, but I always loved it. And I was always writing things down, and whenever we would go on a family trip, we go camping or something, I would always have a notebook, and I would come up with little poems and rhymes, and I would read them out. I was one of 4 siblings, and I would read them to everybody in the car, and I made up plays, and I would have the other kids at the bus stop perform them with me. I was always into that kind of thing. It was just, I think it just had it in me, and no one ever told me to do it. I don't think anyone was particularly encouraging about it, but I have a very vivid memory. I think my family was also kind of mystified why this was happening, why I was always speaking in rhyme. It was sort of an odd thing to do. And then I wasn't even that old. I must have been 7 or 8, and my dad had stamp collections. I was just thinking about saying that. And so I always would do stamps with my dad, and some of them would have writers on them, and I always was interested in that. And he gave me this book of Gerard Manley Hopkins poems that he had from some intro to lit class that he had done in college. And he just looked at me almost like he was like giving me medicine or something. And he was like, I think you should have this. It was funny. And I was like, oh, and I felt like he got me, and he gave me these Gerard Manley Hopkins poems. I was 8. I don't think I understood what was going on in there, but I remember that there was like sometimes books would have that bookmark in them that you could move from page to page. And I was fascinated with the bookmark and that you could move it and it was part of the book and you couldn't lose it. I was much more interested in the object of it and the ceremony of this book and having gotten it from my dad. But I still have that book. So nice. I think I got the message from him, and he's like, all these rhymes you keep forcing upon us in the car, someday maybe you'll be an old man in England writing poems. I don't know.
Anything could happen.
Something like that, yeah. Yesterday I had my son asked me a question about this. He's 4. And we speak Spanish at home, so he said it. And I was asking about a poem. He's like, where's this poem from? He asked me. He's like, este muy, muy ayer, which means like very, very yesterday. And I love that sense of poetic time, because I do think that's the beauty of poetry, is that it's yesterday or it's very, very yesterday, and that the poems that last could either have been written actual yesterday, 24 hours ago, or very, very yesterday, 200 years ago, the way Shakespeare's poems or other poems last. So I think that is the way I look at poems. There's some kind of yesterday to me, as long as they feel something I connect to in them, maybe.